In training jiu-jitsu over 20 years, I've had all sorts of injuries. And recently, I even got an MRI scan of my spine, and let me just say the results were not pretty. In this video, I'm going to share everything that showed up on my scan, including bulging disc, wear and tear, and even some spinal cord compression. I'm also going to talk about some of the symptoms I've had, like pain, limited mobility, tingling, and even some weakness. One time it even got so bad, I wasn't even able to turn the key to unlock the door to my apartment. If you haven't experienced some of these things already, if you train long enough, you're likely going to experience at least some of them, as jiu-jitsu is absolutely brutal on the neck. I'm also going to share some of the stupid stuff I've done over the years that have led to these issues, and a few things I've done, including changes to my jiu-jitsu game to help relieve and manage these symptoms. You know, who knows? Maybe you can even learn from my dumbass mistakes and avoid a few of them yourself.
You best protect your neck.
And if you don't already know me, my name's Sean. I'm a BJJ black belt and a founder of the BJJ education app, Digitsu, which if you wanted to check out, I put a link in the description below. By training jiu-jitsu, we're putting our necks past their intended limits on a routine basis. We're stretching and putting pressure on our necks in all sorts of different directions with things like guillotines, cross faces, darces, anacondas, and so on. What's so scary about spine injuries, especially around the neck, is that the joints are really small and the space for our spinal cord and different nerves are really narrow. If you damage or put pressure on the spine or nerves, it can affect everything below it. You can kind of think of it like those old Christmas lights. If you cut some wires earlier on, it can turn off everything else past that. The nerves in the spinal cord are kind of like those wires. They connect the brain to the rest of the body for things like feeling, movement, and even essential bodily functions. For an extreme example of what can happen, brown belt jiu-jitsu athlete Ben Kunzel was preparing for the Nogi Worlds, and he was having his last hard training session before the tournament and the last roll of the day with his friend and training partner. When he went for fireman's carry takedown, but then slipped on the mats, at the same time his training partner went to defend the takedown. Then his training partner's entire body weight ended up falling right on top of Ben's neck, which dislocated the C5, C6 bones in his neck and ended up pushing them into his spinal cord, which immediately left him paralyzed from the biceps down. It's terrible what happened to him, but it's been really inspiring for me watching his recovery and positive attitude. I strongly suggest you give him a follow on social media. You know, fortunately, I've never had to deal with anything anywhere nearly as serious as that, but I've had all sorts of injuries to my neck over the years. So it really came up as no surprise that my scan came up with all sorts of things. Starting from the top of my neck down, the first results that came up were at the C3, C4 level. There were all sorts of mild degenerative changes here. By the way, if you're not already familiar with what like C3, C4 means, I'll get into that a little bit later. But the results for this part of my neck actually aren't that bad, but trust me, they're going to get a lot worse. I'm going to break down what everything means in that result, but before I get into that, I just wanted to share a quick story with you about when my jiu-jitsu neck injury journey first began.
Nostalgia is truly one of the great human weaknesses, second only to the neck.
So I can remember exactly when it all started. It was over 20 years ago. I just got in my blue belt from Matt Sarah down on Long Island during my summer break. And I've just gotten back up to college where I was going to school in upstate New York. We had a small grappling club up there and it was mostly wrestlers. Like I was the only one with a real rank in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu as a blue belt. It was very hard to find any like real Jiu-Jitsu in that area at the time. And I was rolling with a wrestler who usually gives me a tough time. Like we have these wars where we'd go back and forth and he had me in a neck crank. It's the one where you have like double underhooks and the head's trapped in the armpit and then you go to sit through. And what happened was I almost had my hand through, you know, to escape the underhook and I thought I could get out and he kept sitting through and kept putting pressure on. You know, I like didn't want to tap out. You know, I'm like a blue belt. This guy like isn't even a real white belt, you know? So even though this guy wrestled for years and was tough, you know, I still didn't want to tap out, especially as something like not technical as a neck crank. So anyway, I'm struggling, you know, I'm still trying to get that hand through and I feel him sitting through. And I remember it took kind of a while, but then all of a sudden I just felt something in my neck and it's like I knew at that point the damage was done. And then, you know, I didn't want to, but then I tapped out. And I remember immediately I could feel pain and swelling. It was this side of my neck here on the left, like right here. I can still feel pain sometimes in that part of my neck. And within an hour, my neck was completely stiff and immobilized and I couldn't turn my neck at all. And then I remember some period of time later, I can't remember exactly, maybe it was a few weeks, maybe it was a month, but then things actually started to get better and a lot of my mobility seemed to return. And it was from that point on for a while, I would just keep re-injuring it. Sometimes it would take seemingly nothing. Like I remember one time, I was passing someone seated guard and they basically just gave me like a light head tap on the top of my head. And immediately I just feel like that swelling sensation. It would never be as bad as that like first time, but it was something I continually dealt with for a few years after. So the lesson here is pretty freaking obvious. Like when you're in a submission, you should just tap early rather than later, especially something as dangerous that involves the neck, like a neck crank.
Yeah. Neck is a vulnerable thing. So if you don't take
is.
care of it, especially when you are abusing it, when you are getting choked, when you are not tapping.
Do you have any neck injury stories from training similar to mine? Please let me know in the comments. I'm really interested. I'm sure others would like to hear them as well. So I never really started to get any of the more like scary symptoms like tingling and weakness until a more recent injury in training about a year ago, which I'll get back into later how that happens. But first, I just want to jump back into the scan results and explain what they mean. Before we get into that though, it's very important for me to mention I'm not a medical professional. None of this stuff is meant to be medical advice. These are just things I learned from talking to doctors and my own research. And I'm sure some of the things I say aren't entirely accurate. If you're experiencing any of the issues I talk about in this video, please consult an actual doctor. So with that stuff out of the way, with a normal healthy spine, there's plenty of room for the spinal cord and all the nerves that branch out from there. And what degenerative changes means, that means changes to the normal healthy structure of the things around our spinal cord and our nerves. That can mean bone like the vertebrae, and that can also mean changes to those discs we talked about earlier. This means reducing the available space around for the spinal cord and the nerves. And over time, these changes can lead to, putting pressure and pinching of the nerves themselves. This can then lead to disruption of the communication between the brain and different parts of the body, and this can result in those symptoms we talked about earlier, like pain, weakness, numbness, and so on. Before we use the analogy of Christmas lights, another one you can use is you think of like a garden hose. When you step on the hose or you pinch it, you're going to get less or even no water out at the other end. And when you hear those things like C3, C4, and so on, those are just labels for the different vertebrae that make up our spine. They're just numbers that start from 1 and work their way down. And the letter just represents different sections of the spine. Beginning with C for cervical, then T for thoracic, and then L for lumbar, and so on. And it's these vertebrae or bones that we take a look at to see if they change shape or degrade over time. And between the vertebrae are jelly-like discs. These basically act like cushions between the vertebrae, and they act as like shock absorbers to prevent the vertebrae from hitting each other. And these discs, they also generally degrade over time, due to injuries and just general wear and tear. With that being said, my scan mentioned a small disc bulge. And when you hear disc bulge or herniated disc, that means the disc is basically sticking out from its normal spot or protruding. And this can result in problems because it narrows the space and potentially can stick out and put pressure on nerves or the spine itself. And, in my result, it mentioned that this disc bulge was resulting in the narrowing of space near my neural foramina, which is a fancy name for just basically the little holes or the space that come off the vertebrae, and that's where different nerves travel through and not the spine itself. The next thing it mentions is mild spinal stenosis, and stenosis is another fancy name they use. In this case, it just means narrowing. So what it's saying here is that the space for my spinal cord is narrowed. This is likely due to some of the degenerative changes here. And the last thing it mentions is mild degeneration of the facet joints. These are on the back of the spine and they aid with like bending, twisting, while also limiting rotation. I'm completely speculating here, but I imagine these are one of the things that could be damaged by like twisting neck cranks or spine locks, like the twister itself. But like I said before, these results aren't nearly as bad as what comes next. If we travel down my spine a little bit further and look at some more results, you can see right away at the C4 through C6, there's just a lot more going on. Now, before we really dive into those results, I want to share with you another neck injury story. And in some ways, this one is even more scary than the last one. It happened a little over a year ago. It was the first roll after class, after some technique, and it was with someone I've never trained with before. Nothing was really spoken, but we were rolling up pretty light. It was basically a warm-up roll. We're giving up position, going back and forth. It wasn't really like a flow roll, but we were clearly warming up. And at one point, I ended up on bottom half guard, and they left a bunch of space underneath them, so I shot underneath and went to set up like a deep half. And typically, I like to play the like Jeff Glover style deep half, so I was completely underneath him, him with his hamstring up on my shoulder and like my head between his legs. And like I said earlier, I was pretty relaxed. And I'm not going to say they were like crazy aggressive here, and I don't blame them for this. Honestly, I should have been more on guard, but there definitely was a sudden burst in strength and intensity that I just was not expecting at all. So like I said, I had them in deep half, and then what they did, they went to go for the escape where they basically stuff the head down and go to hop over into like a reverse half guard. And since I was relaxed, what happened, as they stuffed my head and had their hips pass over it, my neck and my head just got pushed past its normal range of motion. Immediately, I felt like a tingling sensation go down my left arm into my finger. Oddly enough, I didn't feel any pain, but I could tell like clearly something wasn't right. And I actually finished the rest of the roll, but then, I sat out the rest of the class after that. And at first, I didn't really think it was that bad. I started to feel a little bit of the pain in my neck, kind of like those strains I talked about I had years earlier. And honestly, it didn't even feel that bad. It wasn't until maybe like the next day when I happened to just get home to my apartment, and for whatever reason, my right hand was occupied, and I'm a righty. So I took my left hand and I went to, unlock the door to my apartment. I had my key and I went to turn it, and I go to turn it and like I literally can't turn the key to unlock the door to my own apartment. And it's not to say I wasn't able to turn my hand. Of course I could do that. The issue was, when you put the key in, it's a kind of a heavy door, it's a big lock, so it takes like a decent amount of effort to turn. But when I had it in there, I just couldn't turn it. Like it was too weak for whatever reason, some of the muscles in my hand. And I didn't know what was going on. I took my right hand and then immediately turn it and unlock it, no problem. And when this happened, I was really confused. Like my first thought was like, oh, I always unlock the door with my right hand and I never have a problem. So maybe my left hand's just weak or something's going on. I didn't even make the connection till like a week later when I was at the gym. And in my workouts at the gym, I log my numbers like in an app. I write down what I'm doing, and I wasn't doing anything particularly crazy. I was doing like 4 sets of 10 reps of pull-ups or something like that. Nothing wild, nothing crazy. And the week previously, I think I did like 10 to 12 reps per set. And after like my second set, I could only do like 8 or 7. And the limiting factor wasn't like any pulling muscles or anything like that. It was just the grip in my left hand. And this is when I made that connection between the neck injury and the loss of strength in my hand. I didn't really make it right away because the swelling in my neck went away like within a day or two. So it wasn't even that bad. So that's why I didn't really make the connection. I just happened to remember hearing that like you can hurt your neck and you can lose strength in the hand. So that's how I kind of figured it out. And I ended up going to a doctor for this, but fortunately within a few weeks, the strength returned to my hand. This is before any rehab or any treatment or anything like that. Now let's go back and break down the rest of those scan results. So as you can see now, there's just a lot more going on, a lot more bulging discs, degradation of joints. And in this case, what's really worse is that things that were once mild are now considered moderate. And due to all these changes, you can now see that the spinal stenosis or narrowing of the spine canal is now considered moderate to severe. And even more concerning, there's a mild impingement of the spinal cord itself. And likely the result of all the narrowing due to the bulging disc, the changes of the vertebrae, it's beginning to then pinch on the spinal cord. And this is scary because as we talked about earlier, damage here can affect everything below it. And if this gets bad, cervical spinal impingement can result in symptoms that you might not expect. Things like loss of bowel control, loss of balance, and weakness just all over. And if this continues to progress and get worse, it can require surgery to correct. I even have one friend who recently had surgery to resolve this, and he's even younger than me. Stories related to neck injuries causing severe stenosis and then requiring surgery is something I've seen pop up over and over again throughout the years. By the way, if you're curious how I got those results, it was part of a full comprehensive body scan with this company called Prenuvo. They provide a service where they do full body preventative MRI scans looking for problems like tumors. They don't get like super detailed and looking into like cartilage of like the knees or shoulders, but it's pretty comprehensive when it comes to the spine. Anyway, I'm not like sponsored or affiliated with them in any way, but if you're interested in checking them out, I put a link in the description below. Also, if you have any questions about this process or service, please let me know in the comments. I read every comment and I'll get back to you. With that being said, you have to be careful when reading into results of scans like this, especially when they're related to the spine. One thing I've heard a lot about and from talking with doctors is that results from scans aren't as correlated with symptoms as you might think. And what I mean by that, there's people out there with really mild scans, like not nearly as bad as mine, and they have much worse symptoms. And then there's people out there with scans that are even worse than mine, and they have absolutely no symptoms. This is why it's common advice you hear is that you should treat symptoms and not scans, especially when it comes to really invasive things like, surgery. One thing thing I'm really curious about is how my scan would stack up against average people who don't train jiu-jitsu, but then also other jiu-jitsu practitioners as well. I bet if you looked at the scans of people older than me and people my age, you would see all sorts of things pop up as well in their scan. But I have a suspicion that jiu-jitsu has basically shifted me forward on that timeline from where I otherwise might be. With that all being said, my plan is to monitor my symptoms and see how they progress, and then also get more scans and see how that progresses. And as far as the scan result itself and trying to improve things or fix things, as far as I understand, that's really difficult. Some of the things like bulging disc actually can heal and improve over time, especially if you're younger, do PT, take care of yourself, and give it some time to heal. But other things like the bone vertebrae, this doesn't really seem to be the case. There are some claims out there that seem to say otherwise, but all the medical professionals I've spoken with have seemed to say that's very doubtful. So after all these years and all these injuries, there's a number of lessons I've learned and a number of changes I've made to my training. As mentioned earlier, don't let your ego get in the way. It's better to tap early rather than late. As you get older, it's much more difficult to recover from injuries. And if you're younger and you get injured, you're in a rude awakening when your injury from 10 years earlier comes back to haunt you. As far as my training, I focus very hard on preventing people from cross-facing me and even controlling my neck in general. This means being sure to use frames to block cross faces, controlling distance, and just being very aware of different guillotines and front headlock entries. For example, when playing half guard, I'll be sure to have my frame up to block the crossface, and I might be willing to give up something like a near side underhook, and I'm okay with that.
If you don't pay attention to this, he's going to grab hold of your head. And like I was saying before, if that distance between his shoulder and me is not held with some kind of frame or some kind of post, then he's able to close that distance on me and he can get close. And once he gets control of my head here, then that's going to lead to other bad things happening. So I never want him to be able to get hold of my head. So anytime he brings his hand to the inside, I'm going to go back inside if that happens.
And if someone does crossface me, then I'm okay with just accepting it. Like say someone has me in a crossface from half guard or side control, I'll just turn my whole body away and kind of accept it rather than fight it head on, as opposed to twisting my spine and then putting my neck in that uncomfortable position. Sure, there's some back exposure here and it's probably not the most optimal way to roll all the time, but I found since I've been doing this, I've been getting hurt much less. Also, this is something very specific to my game, but I don't rely on deep half anymore and just try to avoid that position as much as possible. And this has been a really tough habit for me to break. I just really want to avoid this position just because it's very difficult to prevent the person on top from pushing down on my head. And when I do end up in deep half, I just make sure to keep my neck muscles activated so it's very difficult for them to, push my head down into that position like that story from earlier. And I also really try to keep them off balance because if they're in balance, then they can push down on my head. But if I keep them off balance, they can't. And then lastly, I just try not to hang out there too long. Now, as far as like rehab and exercise and treatments, I've tried all sorts of things over the years. I won't get into it too much here, but one program that has given me really good results is called Ultimate Human Performance. I'm not like sponsored or affiliated with this program at all, and a buddy at my gym got me into it. I was really skeptical at first, but it's really worked. I believe Eddie Bravo also swears by it as well. It's a series of super simple stretches, but what I like about it has different benchmarks or goals you should strive for each of the different stretches. I've actually gotten the most benefit and the biggest relief from literally the first two stretches. Also, I spend a lot of time sitting behind the desk as a software engineer, working behind a computer. This wasn't always the case, but now I put a lot of effort into making sure my setup is good for this. Like without a doubt, sitting behind a computer for countless hours coding has at least contributed to all my neck problems. I talk a lot about ownership and BJJ on this channel, and to me, I feel like that also extends into your own health and longevity. As I've gotten older, I learned that it's important to learn about your own health, your own injuries, and your own limitations. You should definitely be proactive. When you get injured, go to a doctor, get professional advice. And from my experience, you're best off finding ones that are familiar with working with athletes. And if you're really lucky, one that's familiar with grappling. One of the reasons why is they're more familiar with sports-related injuries, but they're also usually far more understanding that training is a big part of our lifestyle. Multiple times I've gone to the doctor after getting injured, and I've gone to medical professionals that don't know what we do. And I've gotten some variation of the same response when I tell them how I hurt myself in training. And it goes something like, why are you doing that? Like, you need to stop training immediately. And the good ones just understand that's not going to happen.
Yeah, that's not gonna happen.
There are now even some medical professionals online that focus primarily on jiu-jitsu athletes. One of them is my friend Nicholas Smith. He's a PT and BJJ purple belt. He's helped me with my neck in the past, and he also develops my strength and conditioning program. But at the end of the day, regardless of how we take care of ourselves, even if you train or not, things will start to break down in your neck. They'll start to degrade through wear and tear, and just a natural part of the aging process. As my friend Kyle once said, we're all just building sandcastles. We should treat the jiu-jitsu journey as a marathon and not a sprint, with the goal of training as long as possible and for as pain-free as long as we can. Anyway, that's all I have for today. Thank you for watching.